For a second, pretend like you didn't read the title of this video. I'll describe a nation and try to guess which one it is. In the American continent lies one of the largest nations in the world. It used to be a European colony in the past, and its current population is in the hundreds of millions of people. Aside from that, it has virtually unlimited amounts of natural resources and a very turbulent political scene. It sounds like I am speaking about the United States of America, the greatest superpower to ever exist, but instead I'm talking about Brazil, barely the greatest power within its own borders. It's genuinely remarkable how similar both nations look at a first glance and how different they turned out. To understand why Brazil is so cooked nowadays, we have to understand their history. For more than 300 years, the nation had to suffer under colonial rule, and not only that, they unfortunately got colonized by the third worst kind of Europeans, Portuguese. The problem with Portuguese people, aside from being really loud and annoying, is that they love sugar, and it happens that Brazil has the perfect climate to grow loads of it. So through some controversial methods, they quote-unquote relocated millions upon million of South Africans to work in Brazilian sugar production. Definitely not a great start for a developing nation, and if you thought things couldn't get any worse, you are sadly mistaken. Since 1942, the nation has managed to crash its currency a total of 7 times. They suffered 2 decades under a military dictatorship, and the standards of living for everyday Brazilians had stayed stagnant for generations. Fortunately, at least for a moment, it seemed there was light at the end of the tunnel, primarily due to a population boom, new discoveries of oil reserves, and some basic level of political stability. The 2000s were the years of the most intense economic growth in the nation's history. In just 9 years, the economy grew 5 times over. To anyone with a functioning brain, it seems obvious that growing so fast in less than a decade is not possible, and something shady has to be happening behind the scenes. But at least for a moment, the world and the people of Brazil felt like the nation was well in its way to becoming a rich and developed economy. And to prove to everyone how successful it was, the nation hosted the 2014 FIFA World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games. It is safe to say Brazil at that time was on the top of the world. But as time passed, it became clear to everyone the light at the end of the tunnel wasn't the exit, but a train heading right towards them. It started with small things. A few officials were caught from bribery, or it became public information that the conditions for building the arenas for the Olympics weren't the best. But as time passed, it got worse and worse. Not only were the arenas of low quality and a pointless waste of much-needed money, but also just a few kilometers away from them, people were living in slums, which completely destroyed the nation's reputation. At the same time, the nation had failed to diversify its economy away from raw material extraction, and when commodity prices and especially petroleum fell off a cliff, the Brazilian politicians realized this was the beginning of the end. But the most important factor is by far corruption. Everyone knew corruption was a thing in Brazil. What people hadn't realized was the sheer scale of it. Tens of billions of dollars every year were stolen by corrupt politicians, and it ended up becoming the largest scandal in human history. An extra reason worth noting is also their terrible geography. It sits very far away from the raw material-hungry economies of East Asia, making it very expensive to ship them there, and also due to most of the nation being covered in either a dense rainforest or mountains, it makes it really hard and expensive to build infrastructure to move people and materials. This is President Lula. He served a total of 2 terms as the Brazilian president, and currently he is serving a 3rd one, and he is quite the character. He started his political career during the 80s, has always portrayed himself as the fighter of the common man, and to be fair to him, during his first 2 terms, he greatly reduced poverty rates all across the nation. Unfortunately, though, most of the improvements can be credited to very expensive social policies, which of course is the main reason he is so controversial in the nation. But still, for the most part, he still was quite popular with the Brazilian public until 2018, when he was accused of bribery and corruption. Though we don't really know what exactly happened behind the scenes, it seems that Lula at least was aware of all the corruption happening under his government. The opposition saw this event as an opportunity to win the elections, and it seems like his conviction was somewhat politically motivated. The fact it's so confusing just proves how corrupt and untrustworthy the Brazilian government is. But regardless, he ran for president a 3rd time and managed to win the election, but this time by a tiny margin. And it's clear that many Brazilians are really skeptical of his policies. Because of that, and also the fact his party performed terribly at the October 2024 municipal elections, he has to cooperate with centre and even centre-right parties in the parliament to secure a majority, which makes it hard for him to pass the legislation he wants. He has now been in office for more than 2 years, so have his policies been successful? At a first glance, yes indeed. Just by looking at their GDP graph, you can very clearly see the economy has grown by quite a bit. And even a lot of multinational corporations have announced plans to enter the country, which is a very positive sign for the economy. But unfortunately, it seems this success, just like the success of the 2000s, might be very short-lived. Much of the growth has just been people coming back into the workforce after COVID, which obviously doesn't count. But aside from that, a very large share of the growth has been caused by rising energy and food prices due to the Ukraine war. The nation is one of the largest exporters exporters of both. So when Ukrainian grain and Russian gas stopped being exported, Brazil was one of the nations that benefited greatly from the war. But now that prices are starting to come back down, the revenues Brazil can expect are also likely to come down. But more important than anything is always a nation's reputation. Objectively speaking, German cars aren't all that better than Romanian cars, but people are okay with spending much more money on a German-made car than a Romanian one, just because Germany and its companies have spent decades building up their reputation for quality and reliability. But when you think of Brazil, let's just say the things that come to mind aren't all that positive. You probably think of slums, violent crime, poverty, and a lot of football. Also, the political and economic crisis the nation has been facing certainly hasn't left international investors and companies with a lot of confidence for Brazil. But while those issues will negatively affect the short-term health of the economy, there is a problem silently approaching the Brazilian economy that will likely destroy any chances Brazil has of achieving economic success. Somewhere during the next 15 to 20 years, the Brazilian population will peak at around 230 million people, and right after will start to shrink and age rapidly due to the very low birth rate, which will put immense pressure on the welfare system of the nation. And unlike Europe and Japan, who face similar issues but have copious amounts of money and resources to deal with their aging populations, Brazil already is running a budget deficit, and if they don't solve this problem in the near future, there is a very real possibility of the nation completely collapsing. In the world, there are four types of economies: the ones that shouldn't be rich and aren't, those that were dealt a bad hand but somehow managed to pull through and achieve immense wealth, those that should be rich and are rich, and lastly, the category Brazil belongs in, nations that should be rich but somehow failed to become one. The story of Brazil just proves even further that what makes a nation rich and powerful isn't its land territory or the resources it has access to, but a capable government and stable institutions. Lastly, we still have to acknowledge Brazil has immense potential, and just like Eastern Europe and Asia managed to do the last 3 decades, if the right policies get adopted, there is no reason to think Brazil couldn't achieve a similar level of success.